October 5, 1944, high over the Netherlands near Overijssel. 5 pilots from the Royal Canadian Air Force's 401 Squadron circled at altitude, their Spitfire Mark 9s gleaming in the afternoon sun. Squadron leader Smith spotted it first, a streak of silver diving toward Nijmegen at impossible speed. No propeller, no familiar profile, just a dart of metal moving faster than anything the Canadians had ever seen in combat. The Me-262 jet fighter banked hard, its exhaust trailing faint wisps against the purple sky. For 3 years, Allied intelligence had whispered about German jet development, but rumours meant nothing compared to the reality now screaming past at over 500 miles per hour. Smith keyed his radio, calling Flight Lieutenant Davenport, Flight Lieutenant Everard, Flying Officer Mai, and Flying Officer Sinclair into attack positions. What followed was aviation history's first confirmed jet fighter shootdown by gunfire in air combat. More importantly, it was the first crack in what German propaganda had promised would be an invincible wonder weapon. The Messerschmitt 262 Schwalbe had just revealed its fatal vulnerability. Within months, American P-51 Mustang pilots would transform that vulnerability into systematic hunting operations that would render the world's first operational jet fighter nearly useless despite its revolutionary technology. The psychological impact of that first jet encounter rippled through Allied fighter squadrons across Europe. Pilots who witnessed Me-262s understood immediately that air combat had fundamentally changed. Captain Chuck Yeager of the 357 Fighter Group stationed at RAF Leiston heard the intelligence briefings with growing concern. The German jet could reach 540 miles per hour in level flight, while the P-51 Mustang topped out at 437 miles per hour. In a straight chase, the Me-262 was simply uncatchable. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. If the Luftwaffe deployed these jets in significant numbers with adequate fuel and trained pilots, the strategic bombing campaign crushing German industry could face catastrophic losses. B-17 flying fortresses lumbering through flak-filled skies at 180 miles per hour would be helpless targets for pilots in aircraft that could attack from any angle and escape before escort fighters could react. For the first time since achieving air superiority over Europe, Allied commanders faced the possibility of losing it. But the Me-262's revolutionary design carried vulnerabilities that arose from the fundamental nature of jet propulsion in 1944. The Junkers Jumo 004 axial flow turbojet engines represented a quantum leap in aviation technology. Yet they were also primitive and temperamental. Each engine developed approximately 1,980 pounds of thrust at 8,700 revolutions per minute, burning through J2 synthetic fuel derived from brown coal at twice the rate of conventional fighters. The turbine blades, manufactured from chromida alloy, because Germany lacked sufficient supplies of heat-resistant nickel and chromium, operated at temperatures that caused rapid thermal creep. Under combat conditions, the Jumo 004B engines required overhaul after approximately 10 hours of operation, with complete engine replacement typically necessary after 25 hours of service. This meant that after perhaps 3 or 4 combat sorties, Me-262s needed new engines, creating logistics nightmares that German ground crews could never fully solve. The engine's throttle response presented immediate tactical problems. Unlike piston engines that responded almost instantly to throttle input, the Jumo 004 suffered from significant lag. Advancing the throttle too quickly injected excessive fuel into combustion chambers before airflow could increase to match, causing jet pipe temperatures to skyrocket and turbine blades to overheat. Pilots had to nurse their throttles with delicate precision, making gentle adjustments and waiting for the engines to stabilize. In combat, where split-second reactions often meant survival, this sluggish response transformed the world's fastest fighter into a vulnerable target during critical moments. The Me-262's takeoff and landing procedures magnified these engine weaknesses into tactical catastrophes. With a wing loading of 294 kilograms per square meter, substantially higher than any contemporary fighter, the jet required takeoff speeds exceeding 110 miles per hour and landing approaches at similar velocities. During the critical acceleration phase after releasing brakes, the Me-262 needed nearly 30 seconds to reach flying speed, accelerating down the runway while its engines struggled to develop thrust at low airspeeds. For those 30 seconds, the aircraft was effectively helpless, moving in a straight line at predictable speed with no ability to maneuver. Any Allied fighter that caught an Me-262 during takeoff had a near-stationary target that could not evade, could not accelerate rapidly enough to escape, and could barely defend itself. Landing approaches presented identical vulnerabilities. As Me-262 pilots descended toward their airfields with fuel gauges approaching empty after 60 to 90-minute missions, they had to slow to landing speeds while configuring flaps and gear, again becoming predictable targets flying straight and level. The revolutionary jet engines that made the Me-262 invincible at high altitude became anchors during these low-speed phases. Intelligence officers at 8th Air Force Headquarters in England studied the problem methodically through late summer and early fall of 1944. Photo reconnaissance missions identified Me-262 bases at Akma, Giuseppe, Rhein, Lechfeld, and Munich-Riem. Analysis of gun camera footage from the few jet encounters revealed the aircraft's high-speed advantages, but also its low-speed weaknesses. Allied intelligence knew that Me-262 pilots, having burned through most of their fuel during high-speed interceptions, had to return to these specific airfields. They could not divert to alternate bases because the specialized J2 fuel required by jet engines was available only at designated facilities. This geographic constraint created an opportunity. If Mustang fighters could loiter near known jet bases, they could ambush Me-262s during their most exposed moments. The tactic required patience, fuel endurance, and pilots willing to fly directly into some of the most heavily defended airspace in Germany. But it offered the only reliable method for propeller-driven fighters to engage jets on anything approaching equal terms. The Luftwaffe recognized this vulnerability immediately after the first jet losses. Commanders installed extensive flak alleys along approach corridors to Me-262 bases, positioning 88mm guns, 37mm automatic cannon, and quad 20mm systems to create curtains of fire that any attacking fighter had to penetrate. They assigned their most advanced piston engine fighters, the Focke-Wulf FW-190D and the rare TSO-152H, to provide top cover during jet takeoffs and landings. Flight schedules were randomized when possible to prevent Allied fighters from predicting launch times. Some bases deployed decoy aircraft to lure attackers into flak traps. The Autobahn near several jet bases was modified into emergency landing strips, with camouflage parking areas in adjacent woods, allowing Me-262s to operate from locations that Allied intelligence had not identified. Despite these defensive measures, the fundamental tactical problem remained unsolvable. Me-262s had to take off and land, and during those phases they became defenseless regardless of how many guns defended them. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361 Fighter Group became intimately familiar with the Me-262 threat during missions over Germany in early October 1944. The 21-year-old pilot from Detroit had encountered a jet on a previous sortie and filed detailed intelligence reports describing its capabilities. On October 7th, Drew was grounded and facing disciplinary action for performing an unauthorized victory roll after a successful mission. His punishment vanished when intelligence reported a concentration of Me-262s at Akma Aerodrome in northwestern Germany. Drew's previous jet encounter made him the obvious choice to lead a fighter sweep against the base. He briefed his flight carefully, emphasizing that success required surprise, aggression, and accepting the risks of flying directly through German flak defenses. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Robert McCandless, would stay with him regardless of what happened. Drew's P-51 Mustang, coded E2-D and nicknamed Detroit Miss, lifted off from RAF Little Walden with full internal fuel and wing tanks, giving him nearly 4 hours of endurance. The weather over Germany that October afternoon was broken clouds with good visibility, perfect conditions for spotting aircraft against the ground. Drew led his flight toward Akma at 15,000 feet, scanning constantly for jet contrails or the telltale flash of sun on polished aluminum. As they approached the known jet base, he spotted them. Two Me-262s on the runway, engines running. Drew pushed his Mustang into a dive. He ignored the flak, his focus on the jets. He lined up on the first and fired. The jet exploded. He pulled up, rolled, and dove on the second, now airborne. Another burst. The second jet caught fire and crashed. In seconds, Drew had destroyed 2 advanced fighters. His attack proved the new Allied tactic worked. The myth of the Me-262's invincibility was crumbling. Drew's victory was a major morale boost. It showed the German jets were not unbeatable. With the right tactics, they could be defeated. The P-51 Mustang in the hands of a skilled pilot was still master of the sky. The hunt for the Me-262s was on. The hunters were winning. The success of Drew's mission led to the rat-catching strategy. The idea was simple: ambush the jets at their airfields during takeoff and landing. It was dangerous, but effective. The Me-262s, slow to accelerate, were sitting ducks. On landing, low on fuel, they were equally vulnerable. The rat-catchers turned the skies over Germany into a death trap. The Me-262 pilots, once hunters, were now the hunted. The psychological impact was devastating. Morale plummeted. The Me-262, Germany's hope, became a liability. The rat-catching strategy was a classic example of superior tactics overcoming a technological advantage. The P-51 was a propeller aircraft, no match for the Me-262 in a race, but the Mustang was more manoeuvrable, had a longer range, and was flown by better-trained pilots. These factors made all the difference. The story of the jet hunters is one of courage, ingenuity, and the triumph of the human spirit over the machine. It reminds us that the weapon is less important than the person who wields it. The men who flew the P-51s were some of the best ever. They were the jet hunters, the men who won the air war over Europe. The final blow came in the spring of 1945. The Allied armies were closing in on Berlin. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The Me-262s were scattered, short on fuel, parts, and experienced pilots. They were a spent force. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The Third Reich, meant to last 1,000 years, had lasted 12. The Me-262, the wonder weapon, was relegated to the scrap heap. But its legacy would live on, in the designs of the next generation of jet fighters and in the memories of the men who flew and fought against it. It was a machine that changed the world. The story of the Me-262 is what might have been, a weapon that, if introduced earlier, might have changed the war. But it is also a story of what was, a weapon defeated not by superior technology, but by superior strategy and the courage of the men who flew against it. It reminds us that it is not the tools that matter, but the hands that wield them. The hands that wielded the P-51s were the hands of masters. They were the hands of the jet hunters, the men who conquered the sky and helped win the war. Their story is for the ages, a story of courage, sacrifice, and the ultimate triumph of the human spirit.